Welcome everybody, this is Ted Ralston at the ThinkTech Hawaii Studios deep in the bowels of downtown Honolulu. With our show we call Where the Road Leads. Today we're going to talk about some of the abstract to the concrete transitions that we need to think about making here. We've had the last couple of weeks discussions at the very abstract level. I'd like to take that down one notch and talk about some of the concrete follow-ons that stem from the abstract work. First of all, how this program came into being, just in case anybody's new to it, this really began with the interest that Jay Fidel had expressed in UAVs about a year ago. We had a panel discussion here. Several of us were asked to comment on the coming issue of the State of Hawaii's UAV test site. And from that, Jay had generated invitations to come on this show several times with other guests and talk about that emerging technology and how that fits in Hawaii's technology evolution and business and such. Now, as you see here, the downside of participating in those panels is that you get to be asked to host one. So a little bit later in our show, I'll introduce Greg Nakano, our guest, and warn him that being on this show is a conduit to hosting the show. So just take that under advisement as we go forward here. So anyway, Jay asked me to sit in for some time here and talk about where we're going in the road to the future. UAV is certainly a big part of it. UAVs as they affect Hawaii. Again, assisting in educational programs, assisting in the actual execution of state business and in actually building business. And we'll get back to the UAVs from time to time. Certainly a very timely subject. There's work going on in the FAA. There's work going on developing the Hawaii test site operational concepts. There's a lot of intrigue and a lot of multi-dimensional opinion going on in terms of how we're going to push UAVs forward. The good news is the FAA is obligated to get in 2015 to get rules on the table that will allow small UAVs to be used in commercial business. So we'll see where that goes, monitor it, and bring back that story to you from time to time. But technology in the broader aspect is really what we're wanting to expand this into and talking about here. And technology, unlike what you might think of our cell phones and high-speed airplanes and things like that, technology is really the art of problem solving at its most basic level. The art of problem solving. And editorially, anybody who solves problems with a new approach is a technologist. I go back to my freshman year sitting in an anthropology class as the question was, well, how do you separate humans from non-humans, and where's that transition point? And at that time, in the early 60s, which is just after the Earth had crusted over, for those of you who are not quite this old, the decision was that if you used a tool, you were a human. Anything that didn't use a tool was at the end of the animal domain. About that time, it was discovered that lowland gorillas take a straw or a piece of twig, lick it to get saliva on it, stick it down into a rotting tree trunk, and pull out a tasty morsel of ants and bugs and things, and then lick them. So I guess at that point in time, it was determined that gorillas are actually people. I think the decision's been changed. But where is technology? It isn't just the things we're thinking of that we buy at or we see at the electronics trade shows. It's really the broader art of solving problems. So if we keep that in mind, that opens up the dimension quite a bit into where we can find technology applying itself to our future. But when we have problems that need to be solved, the art is in how do we really put our arms around that? How do we characterize the problem in the first place that we're trying to solve? Many times we launch off on a solution with really not having the problem well understood. How do we measure the size or the scope of the problem? Where does the problem end? How do we seek options that are going to get us to the desired end state? And the correct option may not be the dominant option. We certainly have seen that in our own lives along the way. How do we check success as the art is being practiced and the solutions are being generated? how do we evaluate acceptance of the conclusions we're coming to or the answers we come up with in terms of are they actually going to be used? Certainly there are many cases out there of well-researched programs that have been well-funded and developed interesting technology that the user wouldn't use because they, with some cultural reason, that solution would not fit with what they've been doing. So the art in this aspect is the pulling all those pieces together and understanding how best to solve the problem. And the technology is that art, certainly from the very specific engineering work all the way to the softer cultural work and the understanding and the cognition that goes with that. So we've expanded the horizon of this program to reach out as far as we can into the broader scope of technology in the future of Hawaii. And of course we'll come back to UAVs from time to time, but we'll hopefully see a lot more. And by the way, a further statement about this show, if you have ideas, if you have suggestions, if you want to come on the show, if you've got folks you would like to recommend or subjects worth exploring, please connect with us, and Zuri will come on in a minute and tell you about that. Again, we'll revisit the UAV business from time to time. We'll revisit the Hawaii exemplary state, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'd like to open up and have somebody from the open water aquaculture, which we've seen a lot of activity of recently, have somebody from that domain enter our picture. I think that's useful across the Pacific, not just here in Hawaii. At another end of the scale is the Falls of Clyde restoration. That's certainly a very interesting topic for us right here. You can see it, of course, right across the Ala Moana here. Most interesting is the world of dynamic complex systems, which is what we're all part of, and how we get our arms around those, how we work, how we cognate, how we make decisions. And we do expect to have some really interesting guests on in the near term talking about that. But please, anybody out there with an idea, let us know. And Zuri, if you're ready to say how folks can contact us, please tell us.
So you can always contact us on Twitter at ThinkTechHI. Send us a tweet, let us know what you would like to see on the show, if you have any suggestions, or if you think you can be a guest or maybe a host. You can also contact us at www.thinktechhawaii.com or find us on Facebook, and we can always stay in touch. Thank you.
And on that account, actually, next Friday and the week after, I will be in Arizona and California at a fair called JIFX, J-I-F-X, Joint Interagency Field Experimentation, which is like a version of our show here with real equipment, real hardware, real systems, real software, where perhaps 70 or 80 experiments that deal in the future world of complex systems, humanitarian assistance and such, get together and attempt to solve problems that are available, the solutions are available by putting more than one piece of technology together. So from that will come many inspirations that we can bring into this program, I think, over the next 3-4 months. So going back a little bit, we had Doug Martin, Dr. Ken Kaneshiro, and Dr. Herb Lee on in the last 2 weeks. And we took a look at the program called Hawaii Exemplary State as an example of the larger art of applying technology to our future here in Hawaii. And for those who may not have caught up with that, Hawaii Exemplary State is an initiative out of the Adjutant General in the National Guard here in Hawaii to look at the uniqueness of Hawaii's position in the Pacific, our uniqueness in terms of isolation and limited supply of available materials in the case of a disaster, we'll say. And how do we bring together all the aspects that manage and control life here in Hawaii and make them interplay with each other in a positive way and in a lean forward way, as opposed to a negative or a lean back way, so that we're ready, we're resilient, we're tolerant of whatever comes at us, and turn that exemplary nature into something that's useful in other areas in the Pacific and maybe even in the continent, and push forward on this larger integration of the pieces that make up life to a better human condition for all of us. In our exploration, we determined that there was sort of a three-legged stool here. Ken Kaneshiro brought to us the idea that systems approach and systems management is going to be a key. That brings in science, that brings in STEM, and that can lead all the way down to the K through 12 to educate that upcoming group of people on these complex issues. Doug Martin brought in the fact that empowerment and extension and extrapolation to the larger population in a way that is continually improving their life. And that means the gathering of the government, the commercial viability, the civil NGOs, and academia all working together is an important aspect of this kind of development. The argument and idea being that if solutions aren't really useful in the economic sense, in the commercial sense, they probably won't last very long. So let's think about the science piece and the systems piece. Let's think about the commercial viability. And then Herb brought to us great discussion and ideas on the comparison of value systems that are used to make judgments about things. We're all raised in a Western framework here, which sort of bureaucratizes everything, including science. So then we have to stick the pieces back together again to integrate to go higher up the food chain. Traditional thinking began at the top at the more big picture level and worked its way down. So these two, in Herb's mind, would be properly looked at in balance of each other. And with that balance in place, the two sides, traditional and Western, can inform each other, and we'll get to the better solution faster perhaps, with sustainability and thriving becoming the desired end state coming out of that. Within that framework of a three-legged stool, some of the big terms we talked about are interdependence, where we want to protect the interdependence. That means each agency or element participating needs to protect its own funding sources and its own sovereignty, but it also needs to work together with others, but not in an adversely coupled way. Innovation is going to be necessary to handle the complex issues of climate change and sea level rise. Inclusiveness, to make sure nobody gets left out. These are the three big terms that we have to think about here. That again leads back to the very interesting subject of systems, all the way from tightly coupled systems. A good example of that is rain generates runoff within a couple of hours. That's a very tightly coupled system that we can see. A loosely coupled system is where we have something like sea level rise and its effect on island agriculture, and the agricultural development on one island affecting that in the other if they're progressing or degressing at a different rate. So systems understanding and how this whole thing plays out and the ability to model it and find those solutions that are useful, we'll get into that in following sessions here. But continuing from that very abstract level down to the practical and concrete level, we decided that this group would take a trip out to Waikalua local fish pond restoration project in Kaneohe. It's been running for about 20 years in conjunction with the local school and with Castle High School, and really observe these pieces playing together in an area that is an integrator of all the runoff that's taking place in that Ahupua'a. We'll bring Jay out with us to the field so we can see some of these things we're talking about, and then bring back a story to you here in the studio. In the meantime, we'll get on with introducing our guest, Greg Nakano, in a minute, but first we'll take a break so that Greg is properly prepared after one more minute here to elucidate wildly on where this is all going.
Aloha, this is Keli'i Akina. It's my privilege to be the host of Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Ehana Kako, what does that mean? Well, many people have heard of E Pule Kako, let's pray together. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Let's work together to build a better economy, government, and society. And every week, Monday from 2 to 3 o'clock, you will see movers and shakers and other people who are working together to build a better economy, government, and society. Again, I'm Keli'i Akina on the Ehana Kako weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Aloha. See you here Mondays 2 to 3.
Aloha, my name is Willow Chang Elion, and I host a show called The Art of Life. We air live every Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. And what we do is basically we focus on individuals who create a unique sense of place for Hawaii. These are movers and shakers, artists, innovators. They are also traditionalists. They're all involved in the archival process, and they make this place a unique place, one that makes Hawaii a richer place to be. I hope you do join us, and certainly tell your friends about the show, whether they live here or they live abroad. It's a way to give back to our community. We're keeping it. Oh no.
Welcome back, everybody. Ted Ralston here at ThinkTech Hawaii Studios in our discussion of the moving from the more abstract discussions we've had on the road to the future to some of the more practical steps that can be taken. I'd like to, at this point, introduce our guest, Greg Nakano. And Greg has so many credentials, I don't even know which ones to stand up here in front of the audience, but, and you could do the credentials of 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or now. They're all playing together in about the most complex way anybody could be credentialed. Let me just say perhaps a Renaissance man might best describe Greg Nakano. And in going from the abstract we've been speaking of to the concrete, one of the very concrete steps one can take is get into a PhD program and push these ideas forward and get educational credit and also inform and advise the rest of us. And that's exactly what Greg is going to do, heading into a PhD program at UH. And so Greg, without any more ado, tell us about yourself a little bit, then we'll get into the subject matter.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and I really enjoyed watching, the show last week and sort of learning more about the approach that you're taking. I'm new to this, and someone once said an expert is someone who has made every mistake possible in a very narrow field of study, so I am still in the process of making lots more mistakes. But as a result of being first in the military for a couple of years and then working in disaster response for a couple of years overseas, it occurred to me that while we could continue to respond after the fact, that perhaps the most effective use of resources is actually to get ahead of the problem before it actually manifests itself. And as the military says, sort of left of boom. So before the IED actually goes off, stop the people planning the IED or stop them from getting the precursor materials that would cause them to be able to create this bomb in the first place. Climate change, I think, is something that has attracted me or is really fascinating because, like you said, it's one of these loosely coupled linkages, and it's a very subtle changes that are going on, and that if you're not looking widely across all domains, you might not really see what the immediate impacts are. So I have been lucky to be admitted into a professional master's program in geosciences, and I'm hoping to study hydrology, specifically looking at freshwater lens of small island nations. And I'd like to pick someplace like the Marshall Islands because according to Professor Camilo Mora and the team that he assembled at UH, by 2047 we're going to see visible impacts of sea level rise, and the areas that are probably most impacted are going to be the small Pacific islands like the Marshall Islands or Micronesia or things like that. So what I'd like to do is figure out how do we take and observe the viability of these islands to continue to sustain life, and sort of like a canary in a coal mine, because their landmass, their fresh water will be impacted more visibly as we have very minute changes in sea level rise than in a larger island like, say, Hawaii or the continental coast like California, by measuring, observing, and recording all the impacts of sea level rise on these small isolated islands.
So in this sense, you're attempting to characterize what the problem is before launching off into a solution.
Well, right. Well, I don't even, right. And certainly there are people who would say that climate change is not happening or sea level rise is not really that big of a problem. So if there's a way that you could take a community that does find it a problem, record their journey to becoming, there are a host of names, but like climate refugees or whatever it's going to be, when they're forced to leave their homeland, and then watch how those not only geological but socio and economic impacts affect that community. I think that would be a valuable research project, and sort of like, I don't know how many people saw the film Chasing Ice, but actually documenting it step by step. And sometimes you don't really see the large-scale impact unless you take long periods of time and are able to compress them into a short film or something that has people show the visible impacts over time.
So we need to observe the future before it gets here, based on the trends that you're seeing in the current situation, and projecting that forward socially, economically, agriculturally, into the consequences that apply to that population.
I'll take that down. You said it much better than I did. Yes. So that's basically the idea.
So what do you think you'll do in terms of, say, the first step after you get launched on the program?
Well, I think the thing is first get smart on who's already doing what, and I think if you look at U.S. Geological Service or NOAA or any of these other agencies, even EPA and things like that, there's an incredible body of knowledge out there, and so many organizations doing so many great things. And I think part of the challenge is that they are experts. They really know their particular field, but the knowledge that they've collected and all the data that they've assembled hasn't necessarily been made available to other organizations, nor is it necessarily understandable sometimes, because it's written for that specific community. And I guess the first thing I'm going to try and do is get smarter on who's who in the zoo, who else is out there and who's already done one snapshot or one orientation of the problem, and then trying to bring them together, or at least assemble all the material in a way that a more comprehensive three-dimensional, four-dimensional view of what the problem is can be shared with everyone, so that, I think you talked about interdependent systems before, and that's really what it is. Show everyone where their particular contribution works within the larger schema, and then how that then can be scaled from a small Pacific island to a larger Pacific island to a coastline or even a
This
continent.
sounds like a perfect subset of the Hawaii exemplary state concept. It's just dealing with a smaller, less populated area, and maybe easier to characterize as a result, but a good test case for how to develop the thinking process and the tools in Hawaii exemplary state. And as you talked about bringing together all the existing research into something that can be a collaborative framework of some kind, it made me think of the meeting 2 weeks ago when we had Kevin Montgomery out here, and using the system he's offered to the exemplary state as part of your research. I think it's available, free, and be a great way to test, and people like me who don't understand all the ins and outs of databasing and such could look over your shoulder and perhaps learn through your efforts on how to make better use of this. But IntelliSense Collaborate is the framework that we spoke of, and we'll see another framework in a couple of weeks, which is the complex adaptive systems interactions mapping, which could be an extension beyond part of the collaboration understanding.
I think I misspoke in a way, is that probably the first step is not to necessarily go out and find out who's already been doing what. It's really to go back to the host nation or the people who are living in those regions and first get their permission and their buy-in. Because I think when you look at the nuclear testing that was done on the Marshalls or some of the other things that were done to them, even though it was pitched or couched in a way of saying, we're actually doing this to help you or for the betterment of humanity, very little was actually done in terms of asking their permission. So probably the first step is to go back and say, hey, is this something that's useful? How would something like this support your pre-existing aims? And then go back around and sort of reach out to Collaborate or the exemplary state and see if that's something that we might be able to use to support the pre-existing.
Right, don't assert that right up front, but find out if that matches what
Right.
the host nation is all about. That's exactly what Doug Martin told us twice, the last meeting and the time before, that the requirements have to come from the host nation,
Right.
or the host culture or population, whatever it may be. Let them express it, and perhaps give them enough ideas or options to trigger the discussion. But
Or maybe
don't-
they have it solved, who knows? No,
Right, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that's
Well,
probably
there
the
was a
first step.
case, I don't know, 20 years ago or so, where an entire vessel was built, a rig, I think it was, a brigantine or something, that had a lot of medical treatments available on it to go to, I think, the Marshall Islands or something like that. And after having got all that built, the host nation said, we don't, we do our own thing. We don't need that. So take your ship and sail back where you came from.
Right.
So yes, having the host nation as a willing partner and a sister in the someone assisting in the characterization of the problem to make sure the problem is clearly stated has got to be number one on the hit parade. So that goes back to our little list here of things that we need to do, characterize the problem. So you've identified the most important part is to have the host nation own the problem and you be the facilitator of the change, but not necessarily the definer of the problem for them. So then we have the discussion of measuring the size of the problem, seeking the options for going forward, checking success. Let's take those through in the next period of time here after we have a bit of a break.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Alice Lee Hagan. I host the ThinkTech Hawaii BizEd Spotlight. We talk about fascinating people and interesting issues that affect our island state here in Hawaii. We broadcast every Thursday from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 4 and on Olelo 54. Make sure you tune in and we'll see you soon. Aloha.
Aloha. My name is David Day. I host ThinkTech Asia, and we talk about international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and we broadcast live every Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock and on Olelo 54. Make sure you tune in, and we'll see you there.
Hi, my name is Seymour Kazimirski. Welcome to Seymour's World. We're here to open minds and facilitate conversations. Our topics range from human interest stories to political stories to around the world stories. I hope you enjoy our show. It's on ThinkTech Hawaii. Thank you.
Ted Ralston here with Greg Nakano, back on at the studios downtown Honolulu of ThinkTech Hawaii, where the road leads, talking about taking concrete steps after having some very abstract discussions about where the future might go and how technology plays into that here in Hawaii. Greg Nakano, our guest again, we were just getting into understanding how he will be making concrete steps out of problems that are difficult to articulate and have perhaps relatively unpleasant consequences if not attended to. But one of the problems I want to bring up that may not be attended to is that I mentioned at the beginning of last session that I'll be actually not here to host this show the next 2 weeks, because we'll be in Arizona and California at an exercise. I also mentioned that by coming on this show, you have the risk of being made the host. And I think you've successfully passed the training. You've done J. Fidel 101. So I may just ask you to sit in this chair next Friday or the one after. So that's the downside of being such a willing volunteer here, Greg. Thank you very much. So what we were talking about is Greg's motion into the future here, his educational, the continuing of his education, moving in different directions and dealing with real problems in the Pacific that are coming up. And let's just take one more crack at defining what that problem is as you see it at a small island and how that relates to the consequences in the larger domain, in the sense that if one island has an issue or difficulty, somebody else has to support it. In fact, sorry for interrupting my interruption, we even heard last night in Waimanalo at the HEART meeting, or the disaster preparedness meeting, something we hadn't thought about. If another island in this chain has a serious situation, Oahu can support. If Oahu takes a hit, there isn't much support available to put the infrastructure back in place here. So what's the nearest closest place? Probably California, Washington, or Oregon. So these are real issues, and they face not just in the Western Pacific, which you're speaking of, but certainly here in Hawaii as well. So back to you, sir, in terms of characterizing the problem as if you were, say, an islander yourself inside that population.
I think as an individual, like most people are very rooted to the place where they're born and raised, and reality for them many times is what they see and touch every day. But inventions like the internet have really connected people and presented opportunities for interconnection and interdependence that previously, 100 years ago, certainly 200 years ago, exceeded the farthest imagination of what was possible. And I think more and more what we are beginning to recognize is that we are, a big blue marble, or as someone put it, a single petri dish that is a fixed set. And unless we find another planet out there that's inhabitable, there is a fixed amount of water, there is a fixed amount of land, there are a fixed amount of nutrients. And so if one member of that larger community on the Earth is acting in a way that injures or insults the greater majority of the rest of the population, then the question is does the rest of the population have to sustain or allow that to happen? And a lot of times it comes down to the question of what are the final, decision points or priorities. And I was always taught that morality or what is virtuous is doing what is best for the greatest good, for the greatest number, for the longest period of time. And so if you can actually do that in a sustainable way that extends the viability and quality of life for as many people as possible, then you have achieved quote unquote goodness, or that's something that's valuable. I think part of the challenge now is we're pressing up against, we've crossed the 7 billion population mark, and the interconnections of what you see in the Safeway soup, in the vegetable aisle of Safeway or something like that, how that got there isn't always seen or understood. So how does that relate back to a small Pacific island? Well, as we're seeing the impacts of climate change and sea level rise, how this small Pacific island, which is 50, I understand Marshalls, for example, is 50 to 60,000 people, how they deal with all these changes are a precursor to, I think it's something like 600 million people who live in coastlines around the world that will be affected by rising sea levels. We can try and measure all the coastlines along all the continents and sort of come to find some sort of characterization of cost-benefit analysis or impact and effect. Or we can take smaller, contained, controlled areas and approach them almost like living sustainability laboratories and share the most advanced, the most ambitious technological resources or cutting-edge solutions to help them retain their lifestyle and the way in which they want to survive on those islands as possible. And then from the lessons that we gain from their implementing those processes, see how we might share those with people living in Lagos, Nigeria, or even Los Angeles, California, or New York in Hurricane Sandy, where they're also dealing with storms and sea level rise.
So we can actually tie the problems together that they're going to see in the small islands with those that are going to be showing up elsewhere, and have a sharing of characterization, a sharing of potential solutions.
Theoretically, yes, and
right.
that's what I'm going to try and find out, is if that's even possible.
That actually brings up the discussion that Herb Lee led us through last week, which is the way language, which are of course different around the Pacific and around certainly Western society to the Pacific, how language and its structure generates how your thinking process goes and how you express something, and not just expression in terms of descriptive, but how you actually think about the problem. And so we would cut across different language sets in that process, and it opens up a whole new meaning of the word translation as you move from translating just words to translating ideas and thoughts. So there's a transformational connection here of some kind, as well as the coupling we spoke of in terms of the physical coupling of things. Interesting. So you have thought this thing through quite well in terms of the value is way beyond just the value to that island. The value is to other places where the ideas can be transitioned to. So we've talked about a couple of different ways to characterize the problem, and it impressed me that it's way beyond just the island itself. I'm saying that again to repeat it so I'll remember it. But we talked about the next step in the chain here is to measure the size or forecast the size of the problem, the consequences of the problem, the consequences of not addressing the problem. So as you think about that, Greg, in terms of the nature of sea level rise and what that does to an island nation, how do you put that together into what people have to do? They have to move, they have to change what they eat, their cities go on the coastline go away, transportation probably changes. What are your thoughts on how they would measure that effect?
And that's where we go back to, I think, the beginning of the scoping the problem is going back to the community itself and trying to determine what is highest on their list of priorities, and then seeing what is in the realm of the possible and what is not. You know, people have said, well, they're going to become climate refugees and they're going to have to leave, but that larger nations will want to go and secure their water rights because of the fishing. But who's to say they couldn't just build a floating island that was then anchored to the submerged landmass and then still claim sovereignty over that? I mean, there are so many different sort of opportunities out there that are being proposed that have never really been employed in a large scale that, again, if we decided to make this a test case and tried to help them find their own solution, maybe we could do that. The other thing I'd like to throw out there as a thought is the idea of watertight compartments. And in the old days, when you had a ship, it was one large container. And the idea was once that vessel or that seam was punctured, the vessel would sink. But over time, what shipbuilders began doing is they started saying, well, let's make different watertight compartments that we can seal up, so even if there's a gash that takes out 1/4 of the bow, there's enough buoyancy in the entire ship to keep it afloat. And I think this goes back to the idea of a top-down response or command structure versus a bottom-up command structure. And if a place like, say, the state of Hawaii, and you were talking, I think, about Waimanalo, if each individual community were to develop their own watertight compartment, then they themselves would be able to be resilient and sustainable, and the larger ship would still float, even though portions of that compartment state had been actually damaged. And so in the term of the Marshall Islands, it would be taking one small watertight compartment and figuring out they are the most vulnerable and they're being buffeted with the most number of assaults in terms of sea level rise and climate change. If we can make that a highly vulnerable, highly risk-prone area watertight, then how can we take those lessons and share them with other communities that are less vulnerable but larger in scale? And if I could, the example would be, we've been working with Manoa, and Manoa is just one community of about 6 or 7 communities in Hawaii, but they've gone ahead and they've developed their own disaster response community and their disaster response plan. And in the course of about 8 or 9 months, they've been able to, they're not done, but at least they've begun to start building their own watertight compartments. So to make Hawaii safe would then be to have each individual district or region start doing the exact same. Instead of waiting for a statewide solution that would cover everyone, have each community start on their own and preparing themselves.
I think that's somewhat related to the Hawaii exemplary state
Right,
notion,
absolutely.
is to generate these watertight compartments. There's also the interdependence of one upon the other and the response to a common threat. I think if you saw last week's show, Ken Kaneshiro showed us what Alawai looks like at Ahupua'a with a 100-year flood going on.
Right.
There's a lot of water
Right.
where there used to be roads and buildings and things. And so in that situation, we go beyond the ability of the water tightness of each unit, I suspect, and we become in another form of interdependence where we have to help each other. So if you take that concept, it kind of goes to the Pacific Islands issue you brought up. In Manoa, we're not going to redesign Manoa, I don't think, to handle sea level rise.
Right.
It's far enough away and high enough that it's going to be only indirectly affected. But the islands you're referring to, with all the population spread around the coastlines, are going to be much more heavily impacted by sea level rise. So going back to your earlier statements about getting the residents, the locals, the local culture, as they express it, to what the nature of the problem is as they see it, would be step number one.
Right.
So that point, that's going to take field work. That's going to take learning a language. That's an incredible undertaking as you think about it. From what.
So it's likely I will be all but dissertation.
A lot of them are on for sure. So again, in the terms of the concrete steps, we're still working at fairly abstract level. Somebody has to get over there and start becoming a trusted communicant of the population and begin exploring where these steps are. How do you see that playing out in as part of your program at UH?
I've done a very brief survey of the resources that are out there, and I think actually there's a lot of work that has been done and a lot of great organizations, everyone from the Australian government to the United Nations to the different organizations, in the United States responsible for example, EPA and USGS and NOAA and things like that. I think the question will be, how does all that collective effort begin to assemble itself? It's like when I was a kid, you get the little Lego blocks. Well, you got all the Lego blocks. Well, how do we take all the Lego blocks and put it into something that is useful and meaningful and recognizable as doing a long-term solution, instead of having 50 or 100 different organizations coming up with the idea that it's a wheel? Okay, well then can we get an axle and a drivetrain and a chassis and things like that? So how do we get beyond step one of just identifying and admiring the problem to actually joining together, sharing information in a way that will allow us to drive towards a solution?
It seems to me from our earlier conversation, just thinking about it now and the way you just expressed it, having the host nation having that host nation be the owner of the problem and the clear descriptor of that problem would take care of self-integrating a lot of the different approaches that different agencies around the world might see. But it's intriguing that what you're saying is the United Nations and many nations in the Pacific have already attended this problem and have written something about it. That must mean they think it's important to them that this not be allowed to happen, or I should say that we mitigate the effects as much as possible because of the consequences to them. So we're beginning to see maybe that interdependence being recognized, perhaps formalizing the way in which it's expressed and having the host nation own it would be a really fantastic output of your efforts.
Well, I would say it's not my efforts. It really would be all these organizations that have already done the work. I think one of the greatest benefits that opportunities like ThinkTech Hawaii are providing is allowing people who might not otherwise have a voice to share what they've discovered and raise the alarm in the case where it is impacting them, so that other people who might have the resources to offer solutions can actually begin helping them out at the appropriate level. So it doesn't have to go through different levels of bureaucracy or different information chains to get validated to whether or not they can help. People can self-select to immediately respond to another person's need and to help them out. And I think the term in the old English law was hue and cry, in that there was a law that you had a moral obligation when someone was injured or hurt to raise the hue and cry so that people could then come, help, and respond. And I think what we all need to be doing is taking care of those who are in need or are vulnerable to these changes, because it's really, in the end, going to be in our own self-interest. By helping them solve their problems, we're going to learn more about our problems and find solutions for them before they arrive to our shores.
And your work, ideally, will provide a higher level view of this than we've maybe seen at the individual lens level. We'll take a look at the larger lens, but at the same time, you have some concrete steps that can go in there and begin assisting in that formative process. And I think the one you've contributed so far here that's the best is to have the host nation, have the host culture in their form of expression, understand and define the problem so that we all work on their problem, not on our problem. As you said, it's great to generate a problem statement and then admire it, but it's even better if he can generate the problem statement and then we generate the various options that go forth to solve it. So we talked about characterizing the problem and the ownership of it, hadn't thought about that. We talked a little bit about measuring the size of the problem or projecting what the consequences would be, not just to that unit, that island, but to the other folks around who have to support them. We didn't talk much about the options for how options get decided to take care of these issues. And frankly, these issues are so large that it's not within our experience to think about the options that are available to solve them. And then we didn't talk about what we should in the future time when you're back on the show again, talk about how we're going to check to success as these solutions come forward, or even as the description of the problem comes forward. How do we check that we're describing it right? I mean, you need a language to describe a language, so these things can somehow, in some cases, be like self-perpetuating. And then last, the acceptance of the problem or the solution, which means prototypes, test cases, something like that that'll let us verify that the work is being done in a proper direction as we go forward here. All fantastic, all necessary, all parts of the Hawaii exemplary state. We could learn for Hawaii exemplary state from your efforts, and you could learn from the efforts on Hawaii exemplary state. So these things do play together very well. And I guess I'd like to consider your experience as part of the Hawaii exemplary state in the context of how we periodically revisit the issue here on this particular show.
As I get smarter, I got a lot to learn.
And as you get closer to this seat, and then you can run it the way you like. So I think that's it for our first discussion with Greg Nakano. And we'll expect you back a lot, bring others with you, and we'll see how this is all going. In the meantime, again, there's going to be a need for a host next Friday and the week after on this very show, since the host won't be here. And Zuri, if you can wrap up again by telling us how people can get information back to us so that we can pick up other subjects that are worth discussing.
So you heard it here. You are able to go on Twitter, tweet us at ThinkTechHI. Let us know if you want to be a host or a guest. You can always go to www.thinktechhawaii.com. You'll see all of our information, and so you can always contribute in any way that you're able to. Find us on Facebook at ThinkTech Hawaii, or you can also tag us in your photos on Instagram at ThinkTechHI. Have a good weekend. Aloha Friday.
Okay, and with that, I think we'll sign off this episode. And Greg, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay.